1945. Europe was burning. American bombers crossed the German border almost daily, their silver wings reflecting the cold morning sun. Below them, cities prepared for impact. Above them, the sky was already a battlefield. On this mission, Lieutenant James Carter gripped the controls of his damaged B-17. He was only 22, too young to be carrying the weight of a war. Yet there he was, leading his crew through hostile airspace. The bombing run had been completed. Factories below were swallowed in smoke, but survival was never guaranteed on the way home. Black bursts of anti-aircraft fire exploded around them. The aircraft jolted violently. Warning lights flickered across the instrument panel. Engine 2 is losing power, someone shouted over the intercom. Carter felt the vibration change beneath his hands. The bomber began to lag behind formation, the most dangerous place to be. Alone, exposed. Then they appeared. German fighters cutting through the sky with terrifying precision. Tracer rounds flashed past the cockpit. Metal screamed as bullets tore into the fuselage. Smoke filled the cabin. The controls grew heavier. Carter looked ahead at the clouds, then back at his crew. He knew something they didn't want to admit. This plane wasn't making it home. The left wing shuddered violently. Another burst of enemy fire ripped through the fuselage. Alarm screamed inside the cockpit. Hydraulics failing, fuel pressure dropping. Carter fought the controls with everything he had. His gloves were slick with sweat despite the freezing altitude. "Prepare to bail out," he ordered. One by one, his crew moved toward the escape hatch. There was no panic, only trained urgency. They had rehearsed this moment. But no rehearsal ever feels real until the sky turns against you. A final explosion rocked the bomber. The nose dipped sharply. Go, go. Parachutes disappeared into the rushing wind. Carter waited. A pilot leaves last. Smoke swallowed the cockpit. The altimeter was spinning down. He stepped onto the wing. The roar of open sky consumed him. Below, Germany. Enemy territory in every direction. For a split second, time froze. Then he jumped. The wind tore at his body as he fell. 1,000 feet. 2,000. He pulled the cord. The parachute snapped open. Silence replaced chaos. And now, drifting helplessly toward the ground, the war was no longer in the sky. The ground was rising slowly now. Too slowly. Carter hung beneath the white canopy, exposed against the gray winter sky. No engine noise. No gunfire. Just the wind and the sound of his own breathing. Below him stretched farmland and scattered forest. Small German houses. A narrow road cutting through frozen fields. He was descending straight into enemy territory. His heart pounded harder than it had during combat. Up there, he had controls, weapons, a crew beside him. Down here, he was alone. He checked his sidearm instinctively. It suddenly felt small, useless. The wind carried him lower. He could now see movement on the road. A vehicle had stopped. A uniformed figure stepped out. Helmet, long coat, binoculars raised toward the sky. They had seen him. Carter tried to steer the canopy away, but the wind decided otherwise. He hit the ground hard in a field dusted with snow. The impact knocked the air from his lungs. Before he could fully rise, he heard it. Boots, crunching through frozen earth. The war had followed him down. Carter struggled to free himself from the parachute lines. His fingers were stiff from cold and adrenaline. The sound of boots grew louder, measured, calm, not rushing, not shouting. He finally untangled himself and turned. A German officer stood several meters away. Tall, composed, a pistol resting at his side. For a moment, neither man moved. The war reduced to two figures in a silent field. Carter slowly raised his hands. He could see the insignia on the officer's coat. This was not a frightened farm boy with a rifle. This was someone trained, experienced. The officer studied him carefully. His eyes moved from Carter's torn flight jacket to the small amount of blood staining his sleeve. Carter hadn't even felt the wound in his arm. The pistol lifted slightly. This was it. No courtroom. No prisoner camp. Just a quiet field and an enemy with every right, by the brutality of war, to pull the trigger. The wind passed between them, and something changed in the officer's expression. The officer's finger rested on the trigger, but he didn't fire. Instead, his eyes narrowed, not in hatred, but in calculation. He stepped closer, close enough now to see that Carter was barely standing. Blood darkened his sleeve. His breathing was uneven. The officer spoke in German, calm, controlled. Carter didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. This was not rage. In the distance, another vehicle approached. More soldiers. If they arrived first, the outcome could be very different. The officer glanced toward the road, then back at Carter. Two choices. One bullet, and the war continues as expected, or something else. The officer lowered his pistol. He gestured firmly, motioning Carter to move, not toward the road, but toward the tree line. Carter hesitated. Was this capture? A trick? The officer stepped closer, speaking sharply now, urging him forward. Engines were growing louder behind them. Time was running out. Carter stumbled toward the trees. Every step sent pain through his injured arm. Behind them, a military truck rolled into the field. Voices called out. Rifles shifted into position. The officer turned sharply and raised his hand. A command, firm and unquestionable. The soldiers slowed, confused. Carter could feel their eyes on his back. One shout, one accusation, and he would be dead where he stood. The officer walked beside him now, close enough to seem in control. To any watching soldier, it looked like a capture in progress. But his voice, low and controlled, carried a different meaning. Keep walking. Carter didn't understand the words, but he understood the intent. They entered the cover of the forest. The officer paused, listening. The truck engine idled in the distance. Then quietly, he holstered his pistol. He looked directly at Carter. No anger, no triumph. Just a decision that could end his own career or his life. He pointed east and stepped back. Carter didn't move at first. He stared at the officer, trying to understand what was happening. Why wasn't he being marched back at gunpoint? Why wasn't there shouting or handcuffs or a rifle pressed into his spine? The officer repeated the gesture, east, away from the road, away from the soldiers, freedom. Carter's heart pounded louder than any engine he had flown. This made no sense. The officer stepped closer, lowering his voice. His expression hardened, not with cruelty but urgency. If the other soldiers entered the forest, everything would change. For a brief second, the two men stood face to face. Enemy uniforms, different languages, same age. The officer extended his hand, not to restrain him, but to steady him. Carter felt the grip, firm, human. No words of friendship, no speeches about honor, just a silent agreement. Live. The officer released him and turned back toward the field. Carter took one hesitant step east, then another, and without looking back, he disappeared into the trees. The forest swallowed Carter whole. Branches clawed at his jacket as he moved deeper between the trees. Every step felt unreal. Moments ago, he had been seconds from execution. Now, he was free. Behind him, he heard distant voices. The truck engine shut off. Boots moving through snow. They were searching. Carter forced himself to keep walking. East, just like the officer had pointed. His arm throbbed with every heartbeat. Blood loss made the world tilt slightly, but stopping meant capture, or worse. As he climbed a small ridge, he risked one glance back through the trees. He could see the officer standing near the field, speaking to the soldiers, gesturing toward the opposite direction, deliberately misleading them. Carter understood then. This wasn't hesitation. It wasn't confusion. It was a choice. The officer was risking everything. Military court, imprisonment, even execution for aiding the enemy. And for what? A stranger. A wounded pilot who had been bombing his country hours earlier. The war had taught men to hate efficiently, to fire without question, to obey without reflection. Yet in that frozen field, one man had chosen something else. Humanity. Night began to fall. The temperature dropped further. Carter found shelter beneath thick pines and finally allowed himself to collapse. He pressed his hand against the wound and stared up at the darkening sky. Somewhere behind him, the officer would be returning to base, answering questions, inventing explanations, carrying the weight of a secret that could never be spoken aloud. Two soldiers, two enemies, bound now, not by war, but by a silent act of mercy. By morning, the forest was silent again. Carter woke to the sound of distant artillery. Not German. Different rhythm. Closer than before. The front lines were shifting. He had walked through the night, guided by instinct and the faint glow of the eastern horizon. Exhaustion blurred his thoughts. Pain dulled everything except one memory, the officer's eyes. Hours later, weak and barely conscious, he heard voices ahead. English. American infantry moving cautiously through the woods. When they found him, he could barely stand. Uniform torn, face pale, dog tag still hanging from his neck. They assumed the worst. Capture. Escape. But Carter shook his head. No, he'd let me go. The medics thought it was shock. Hallucination brought on by blood loss. But Carter knew what had happened. Somewhere behind enemy lines, a German officer had chosen conscience over command. After evacuation and months of recovery, Carter tried to report the incident. There was no record, no name, no proof. Just a moment in a frozen field that no war archive could document. Years passed. The war ended. But Carter never forgot the face of the man who could have ended his life, and didn't. Decades later, Carter would tell the story. Not in newspapers, not in books, only in quiet conversations among those who would listen. He spoke of a war where lines were drawn, but humanity sometimes crossed them. Of a soldier who chose mercy over orders. Of a moment when the rules of war bowed to the law of conscience. The man who saved him remained nameless, anonymous in history, yet immortal in memory. Carter never returned to that forest, but every time he looked at a photograph of the 1944 skies, or a faded map of Germany, he remembered that morning. A reminder that even in the darkest times, courage and compassion could survive. And sometimes that single act of mercy was enough to change a life, and perhaps a soul. The war ended, the guns fell silent, but the memory of that German officer's choice remained louder than any command. It was a story of war, but also a story of humanity. One man, one choice, one life saved against all odds.